Hello and welcome to another edition of the RevOps Lab podcast. Our guest today is Gabe Rothman, and I'm also very happy to say hello to Yanis, who also joins us for this episode. Hello to both of you.
Hey guys, great to see you again. Had a good time meeting you guys at the RevOpsAF event last week. So yeah, it was a good time. Good to catch up so quick.
Yeah, it's good to be back on the podcast. And Gabe, great to see you again. It was awesome.
Yeah. I mean, you just said it, right? Like Gabe, we met at the RevOpsAF 2024 conference in San Diego. Really good. Just a few days, actually last week. So I'm like not jet lagged anymore. Nearly, still a little bit. 5% jet lag is still there, I think. I think we were really blown away. We got to know you. We didn't know you before. Had a really good night with you at a bar, but then also more sober later at lunch. And you showed us really the structure and diligence of how you run comp planning. You also did a session at RevOpsAF that was well received from what we heard from other attendees. So we figured, hey, you know what? Let's invite you to the podcast because comp planning is always a great topic and it's not talked about enough, I think, particularly from a RevOps perspective. So we want to dive a bit deeper into that. But before we begin with comp planning, who are you and how did you end up where you are right now?
Who am I? I didn't know we were going to start with such broad philosophical questions. That's a hard one. Now, I am vice president of operations at a company called Rescale. Rescale is a software orchestration platform for running computer simulation on cloud-based high-performance computing. So I know that's kind of a mouthful, but the analogy I generally try to use is, pardon me, if you're, say, a big automotive company, of which we have several, and you want to run crash test simulation on AWS, you can use our platform to do all the orchestration between the simulation software and the cloud infrastructure. Another analogy I like to use, just to put kind of a finer point on it, is if you think about your laptop, right? Your laptop has a processor, it's got an operating system, and it's got applications. Obviously, it has more than that, but those are the three of the big ones. And the operating system does all the stuff in between the software applications and the processor, right? It starts programs up, it shuts them down, it allocates memory and processing power and does all the stuff. You can sort of think of us as the operating system for running high performance computing based simulation in the cloud. And what else? Who else am I? I guess a little bit of additional background. I've been in the operations / RevOps space for, I think, 12 years now. And I started at a consulting company called Blue Wolf, which is now an IBM property, doing mostly Salesforce implementation consulting. And I landed there as my first job kind of in the tech space after a 4-year stint as a insurance and construction litigation attorney, which it's a long time ago, but suffice it to say, it wasn't for me.
So just a short note on that. I think you're the first litigator we have, litigator turned RevOps person on the podcast. So, hey, Gabe.
Yeah. I will say that while unless I absolutely had no other choice, would never, ever go back to being a practicing attorney. I don't regret the education. Law school was really interesting. And actually, law school and even practicing as an attorney teach you a very sort of transferable skill set when it comes to the operations world. Operations all about problem solving, about breaking down issues into their component parts and figuring out how to build them back up in the most efficient way. A lot of what you learn in law school, at least in American law schools, is the thinking part of how to be a lawyer. Right? They really teach you how to think like a lawyer. You obviously learn a lot of information about the law, but the fundamentals are, how do you think like a lawyer? How do you think strategically and logically, and how do you break down problems in order to solve them or craft an argument or whatever it might be. So it's also helped me in my personal life. my wife and I have avoided getting screwed, so to speak, a few times because of my legal background. So it's been good that way. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. I think, definitely rare to hear that. And I think also much more common in the US that you have these transfers. So you study, law, but then you transfer at some point into business. I think much rarer, particularly
we
in
also
Germany.
have more lawyers.
Yeah.
Lots of lawyers.
Not sure if that's a good thing, but
no, it's not.
Yeah.
We have a lot of lawyers. So yeah.
Cool. I think what's super interesting also about just going back to Rescale, right? It's a very technical product, and from what you described, I know, right? It's consumption based in terms of the pricing and the billing model, and it's also probably quite high touch, right? So this is a product that needs to be explained. This is not a PLG motion or low touch, high velocity, like small deals, but probably it's a bit bigger, right?
We'd like, I shouldn't say we'd like it to be. We would like there to be a PLG applicable version of it at some point, but it'll never be, not for the enterprise. It'll never be a PLG motion for large enterprise companies, unless some fundamental things change about the way that industry, that ecosystem works. But yeah, I would say that it is very high touch. And so what we're doing sort of flips the percentage of touch, right? So if you do it yourself, it's, 90% high touch and 10% sort of plug and play. We're sort of reversing that, right? Like we're helping you do about 90% of it through our platform, and then the other 10% is implementation time and loading different software applications that you may want to use that aren't necessarily natively supported. Like if you have a specific application or a custom software application, some companies build their own simulation software, that kind of stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, got it. I mean, this is why you buy software, right? Like you try to increase efficiency, enable processes, enable workflows without adding overhead, hopefully. I mean, that's the ideal outcome, at least, I would say. Not always the case, but you should try. So the talk that you gave at the conference, it was comp planning in complex scenarios, I think was the title. The complex scenario referring to the complexity that you experience at Rescale, or I think so, right? So because you have the consumption, you have the high touch, so it's a complicated process. Different people are involved, so that makes comp planning, of course, a lot more complex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly. My goal in that presentation was to use the complexity of our business as a framework to help the attendees kind of think about how they might do that for their business, right? Like obviously everyone's business is different. If you attended that session and thought you were just going to plug and play, run a comp planning playbook based on what we did, that probably won't work well. But if you attended and looked at it sort of through a broader lens and said, well, what can I take from this, or what can I learn from this, and how to think about solving that problem, right? How to think about the challenges that we might face in our company that we really need to be cognizant of, it was probably useful. But yeah, the complexity in our business comes from several sources. One of them you pointed out, we're fundamentally a consumption billing model, which has a whole set of challenges that come with it. But also, there's a component of our business that it creates not an issue per se, but we have to think about gross margins fairly intensely because we pass through cloud infrastructure as part of our product. It's bundled into our product. So we have to pay for that, obviously. And as a result, we need to be very sensitive to the impact that can have on our margins. And in particular, it creates a situation where we sort of don't actually know what our margin on any given deal is going to be until the end of the deal, until the end of the contract, because different core types have different price points. So the price points that our customers are running their jobs on vary depending on what they're using. And our platform fee does not vary, at least once it's contractually determined, right? So the amount that they're paying us to use the platform, which is also billed on a core hour basis. So if you have someone who runs all of their compute on something that costs 2 cents per core hour, and our platform costs, say, 6 cents per core hour, then it's, at least in the context of those two things, it's, 75% gross margin on the platform piece. But if the price of that core type is 6 cents a core hour, it drops to 50%, right? So we don't know what that's going to be. So we have to run a lot of what we call prescriptive margin analysis during the deal making process. So those are just two factors that really contribute to that. And we have to be sensitive to how we manage them. And I think one of the points that I made in the presentation is that just because you have a hammer doesn't mean that everything needs to be a nail, right? You don't have to solve everything with comp plans. And you shouldn't. You should really think about, in fact, perhaps not even trying to solve problems per se with the plan itself, but really focusing on how do we incentivize the behavior and the resulting growth in our business using these plans.
One note on just what you said, I think this is something that most AI first companies are actually facing right now, that you often still price it quite traditionally, right? And then you have underneath APIs that cost you depending on what you actually, how it's actually used. And I don't mean the infrastructure, more like the application layer, which I think makes it really complicated from a compensation perspective. So you mentioned, right? You mentioned that it's consumption billing. You mentioned that the gross margin isn't 100% clear. Do you also have a long sales cycle? You close the deal, and then there's a gap to go live, and then actually you don't know what the deal value will be, even at month 3, or and then is that also a reality for you?
It is. As we talked about, we're a pretty heavy touch implementation, and that's by design. We have a lot of customer success and support resources, and even an engineering team within our engineering department. They do a lot of stuff, but one of their major mandates is supporting the software layer of our ecosystem, at least as it pertains to our product. So there's a lot of support. So usually we're pretty good at limiting time to value in terms of getting a customer implemented. But yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, the sales cycle is long, and then once we're live, we don't actually know when a contract is going to end either. So and that's a big complicating factor in the kind of billings versus booking analysis when you're talking about designing comp plans. Because we're a consumption-based model. Well, let me back up. So we try to structure our business as like a subscription kind of recurring revenue model for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is that's what the investor community kind of wants to see from SaaS companies. So we sell our product on 1, 2, 3-year contracts and beyond. The problem is that if you sell a 1-year contract, it's not really a 1-year contract. It's just an expiration date, right? They give us a predefined amount of money that we load into our platform. And then as they consume, right, we just burn down. We call it a deposit. We just burn down the deposit. So as a result, in all likelihood, the minute you sign that contract that says this is a 1-year contract starting from, today's June 5th. So you have until June 4th of next year. The minute you sign that contract, your projections about what they're going to consume, the contract end date are immediately wrong. Almost certainly immediately wrong. Because consumption doesn't happen in a linear manner, right? Customers will go for long periods of time without doing anything on the platform because they're spinning up a new project and they're setting up their models and they're doing investigation to support the new product that they're building out or a new feature that they're building out. And then they'll run a flurry of jobs over, maybe as little as a couple days to a couple weeks. And then it might go quiet again or relatively quiet. So it's spiky. And the other thing is that generally speaking, because there's this expiration date looming about how long they can use the current deposit, they will generally, if they understand during the sales process, they really grok the billing model, they'll generally underestimate their usage, right? There's no harm for them in just having to sign a new deal early if they've budgeted for it. So a lot of times you sign a 1-year deal and they burn through the deposit in 9 months or 6 months. And then you have to sign a new deal. And then a lot of times after they've done that, they have a better sense of what their usage is going to look like. And so they might increase, right? If they signed $100,000 for the first contract and they burned it in 6 months and they want the next one to last close to a year, they might renew for $200,000 at 6 months, which is in a broad sense a fantastic problem to have. Right? That's great. We'll always take more money. From a comp planning perspective, it's a challenge because in particular, if you want to comp on bookings, right? Because just to make the thought experiment easy, if you sign that customer on Jan 1 for a 1-year deal and they burn through everything by July 1, and that was $100K, and then they sign a $200K deal on July 1 to take them through July 1 of the next year, you've booked $300,000 in the year. But when you go to look at it from especially when you look at it in a renewal versus growth context. In a new business context, it's a little bit easier because you don't have like a renewal component. You're not trying to parse out how much did they grow and whatnot. But even that being said, this problem still exists in the new context. And the challenge is that when you comp on bookings, we're going to comp on $300,000 of new business. in the context of a new customer, and say if it was in a renewal context and their renewal target was 100 grand, right? So that goes to renewal, and then you're comping them on $200,000 of growth. Well, from a billings context, like a run rate context, they didn't book $200,000 of growth in the current year. Well, sorry, they did book $200,000 of growth, but that's not $200,000 of run rate by definition, because that consumption is going into the next year. So you have to balance these issues of well, from a bookings perspective, we're kind of going to overpay, right? Because the base commission rate on expansion, say, is higher than the base commission rate on renewal. And so the challenge of comping on bookings being that there is this moving target that you have to account for. So the upside of comping on bookings, which is the model that we've chosen, is that it's very AE friendly. And our goal is to have AE friendly comp plans for a host of reasons. One of which is we have long sales cycles. Another is that our product, it's not, I wouldn't say it's difficult to sell in that like we don't win a lot of deals. We do actually win a lot of deals, but it is a long process. It's arduous. And we need plans that keep our AEs happy and keep them motivated to stay as resilient as possible, right? So if you book on, if you comp on billings, it's great for the company, right? Comping on billings is super easy. It's or even more to the point, revenue, right? If you just took the approach of running sales comp on just like a monthly basis based on the previous month's billings, you kind of know it. You can kind of break it down exactly as it happens. You know exactly how much is new and exactly how much is renewal once it happens. The challenge is that the commissions are delayed, sometimes substantially. So it's sort of like weighing those two things. And we've put a bunch of stuff in place to try to mitigate the risk around the bookings comp model.
I have many questions, but let's start with maybe a few. So number one, what happens if you sell a 100K deal for 12 months, but they only consume 50K, right? Do they still have to pay the 50K? Because that would be an issue if you have a commission to bookings, right? Yeah,
they do. So again, our model says that you give us X amount of dollars, you have Y amount of time to use it, and if you don't use it in that amount of time, it goes away. We do have an extension process, and historically we've been fairly liberal with it for a number of reasons. We're a small company. We're getting bigger, but it's very hard to tell, a company the size of like, Ford, whatever. Actually, Ford's not a customer. It'd be nice if they were. Not yet. We're working on it. But it's, it's hard to tell a company the size of like Ford to shove it, right? To be like, well, sorry, you're just, you're out of luck. So we've been pretty flexible on it. We've been getting more stringent in allowing, or I guess not allowing people to do that. But obviously it's in our interests to make sure that customers don't overcommit for that reason. And we do a pretty good job. So again, but you do point out something that is another challenging thing to balance in our sales cycle, which is obviously we want to get as much money as we can up front. But we do ourselves a disservice if we sort of convince the customer to overcommit. So our sales process is very consultative. It's very much a
So I
partnership.
have a follow-up question on this. So,
Yeah, go
I mean,
ahead.
obviously, it sounds to me as a customer, I would be stupid if I, commit to 1 million if I don't know if I spend it and then have to pay it, right? So I would
Yep.
rather, like, I'm incentivized to keep the volume realistic,
Yep.
and that kind of balances the commission of the rep out, right?
Yes.
But then, how do you incentivize expansion? Because I assume that's a really important piece of the pie, right? Like. And is that, from an ownership perspective, is that still owned with the AE that runs the deal, or do you already have a handover? How do you organize that? Because I think that directly impacts the comp of the team, right?
Yeah. So to answer your second question, AEs own their accounts, with the exception of maybe if we do like a little bit of a territory shuffle, that type of thing. AEs own their accounts in perpetuity, regardless of the context. We want to maintain consistency in that relationship. And from like a renewals and growth standpoint, we do, as I mentioned, have a pretty engaged CSE team. In terms of the incentive structure being sort of like slightly perverse relative to our desire to get as much money as possible, that is true. But the levers that we use to try to motivate customers to give us more money up front, within reason, are pricing, discounting on the platform fee. We have something that we call a deal desk credit, which is basically just a chunk of money that we put in their account, which is actually the preferable route for us, just because it's easier from a contracting perspective. It doesn't persist contractually, so it's a little bit easier to deal with. And then, there's a host of other stuff. We can give discounts or free training, or we can have a dedicated customer success engineer that we can throw in or discount to make it more palatable. So we use all of the different pricing levers to try to keep the customer from completely under committing, right? Because again, to your point, the last thing we want is something that ends up looking more or less like a pay-as-you-go model, right? We do have that, like customers can give us a credit card and just month to month pay what they want. But we like to think that we create enough incentives for customers to commit up front. And that's been borne out. I think our pay-as-you-go model is less than 5% of the business. So yeah, it's been working well in that regard.
I think with complex systems, something I remember back at university, this was one of the topics. You have complicated systems, you have complex systems, and then you have chaotic systems. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming it's not too chaotic at Rescale yet, right? Maybe that comes at some point. But there are also principles I think you can apply to manage complex systems, right? Like what I'm saying is, like, a complex system, it does not need a complex solution, right? Maybe that's actually like a really bad idea to follow such an approach. And I think you alluded to that in your talk. So I'm curious, like what kind of principles do you apply to manage a complex system and actually reduce the complexity for comp planning specifically?
Yeah. So there are kind of, and as you mentioned in the presentation, there are 4 kind of first principles that I identified. The first one being to limit complexity. And the reason to do that, or one of the reasons, maybe the biggest reason to do that, is, again, to come back to another first principle, which is that comp plans should be designed to drive seller behavior, right? At a fundamental level, that's what it is, right? You're trying to tell the sellers through the plan that we want to emphasize, these things in our sales cycle this year. So if you design a plan that tries to do too many things, it has, tons of different accelerators and spiffs and all sorts of different ways that, the AE can make money. It sounds cool, right? Oh, if I do this, I get, a 1.5x an accelerator. And if I do this, I get a 2x. And we have spiffs to sell this, and this. For one thing, it's noisy, and it can actually prevent the AEs from focusing their efforts. And if you don't build it right, you could even create unintended conflicting incentives in the plan.
Yeah.
Right. So our goal is to identify maybe 2, maybe 3 things that we want to motivate the sellers to do, and really leave it at that. And then anything that doesn't fit inside of that narrow construct, we're going to solve in other ways, right? So mentioned deal desk credits earlier, right? Deal desk credits. Deal desk itself is one way that we do that. We have our deal desk set up in a manner that is somewhat unconventional. What most companies refer to as deal desk, we call sales support. And so that's a function. Both functions are on my team, but sales support is a function that does typical sort of like transaction process support. They're helping with quoting, they're closing out the deals, making sure everything is like buttoned up before we close it out. They're helping the AEs get through approval processes, that kind of stuff. Deal desk is a strategic pricing function, and their job is to support our AEs on our most complicated deals. Biggest deals, the ones that have the most gross margin risk, for example, because those big deals sometimes require very deep discounting, right? And so as an example of something that we could have put in our comp plans, but didn't because we don't want our AEs spending time on it, is gross margin, right? We could have had something in our comp plan that says, you get a spiff if the aggregate gross margin of your deals across the year, hits some percentage. But that's going to create a ton of work and wasted effort on the AEs. They're going to want to know in every single deal, they're going to want to know the margin profile of all of the infrastructure that we sell. So then we're going to have tooling that allows them to sort of like back of the napkin calculate what the margin profile would be based on a prospective usage pattern. It would create a whole bunch of superfluous, unnecessary work on the part of the AEs. So instead of doing that, we basically just say we have this strategic function called Deal Desk. They know the pricing for everything across the company. They know all the bundling rules. And they have their own tooling that we have built that allows them to calculate prescriptive margin on the fly. And then we basically just said, we just put a term in the plan that says very explicitly, so this is actually another point, which is that there's no reason to hide the ball in your plans. Just be completely transparent, right? Mm-hmm. Even about the bad stuff, especially about the quote unquote bad stuff, right? So we just have a term in our plan that says, hey, if you're selling a deal that is above, I forget what the value is, above some value, and the prescriptive margin profile falls below a particular threshold, the company reserves the right to make a manual discretionary adjustment to the commission. And it's fine. They know it. We know it. It's clear. They're not surprised after the fact. They know that that's going to be the case when they close the deal because they work with Deal Desk, right? So that's an example of how we limit complexity, right? And it's an example of when I said earlier, like, just because you have a hammer doesn't mean everything needs to be a nail, right? Solve these challenges in the way that makes most sense for the business.
Good. Yeah.
It's a great example. It's a great example. Yeah.
There's 3 other first principles. I'll try to be a little more brief on those. The 3 others I talked about are being outcome oriented, not overcommitting, and in the presentation, I said, bend reality to your will. And that last one, it really just means that like the world is your oyster in a sense. Like there aren't any like hard and fast rules in doing this. And so don't get mentally constrained by what you think comp planning is or should be. There's this notion that people want to build plans that the AEs can't game, right? People are worried about people trying to game the plans. And I think that is a Sisyphean task, right? It's like you can try, and you might succeed a handful of times, but eventually someone is going to figure out a loophole in your plan. So my point of view is just embrace that. In fact, any good AE is likely to sit down with their plan the first day they get it, read it, and figure out how they can make the most money through that plan.
I mean, it's their job. Yeah.
Right. It's their job. And so the notion of AEs, quote unquote, gaming a plan to me is sort of a semantic distinction, because that's literally what you want them to do, right? There's a pejorative sort of implication in the term, game the plan, but that's literally their job, as you mentioned. You want them to do that. So just design a plan or design a game that has the outcome that you want, right? Instead of trying to like do all these things to make it ungameable, right? Yeah. The other two are sort of interrelated, be outcome oriented and don't overcommit. Ultimately, I try not, or we as a business, so that's my team and finance in particular, we try not to worry too much about any individual AE. So in other words, like if an AE completely annihilates their plan one year and just gets paid really absurd amount of money, which actually happened last year, and an AE get paid a lot of money. That's okay. And maybe that's good for a number of reasons, right? Not the least of which is that other AEs see that that's possible. As long as that doesn't destroy your variable compensation budget, right? That's what matters. Who cares ultimately how it's distributed? I mean, obviously you don't want a scenario where you've got 2 or 3 AEs making a ton of money and then nobody else making any money. That's not good. That's a people problem. You're going to have AEs leaving. But at the end of the day, all you should really be concerned about is developing a fair plan that will not, even in outlier scenarios, completely destroy your variable compensation budget. And then on the first principle of not overcommitting, it's really just making sure you sort of like leave yourself outs, right? So I mentioned that deal desk provision, right? That's an out that we have, right? It gives us flexibility to say, hey, this deal is problematic from a gross margin perspective, so we need to make some adjustments here. We have another term in our contracts that's very straight, or not our contracts, our comp plans, that's very straightforward. It just says this comp plan is not a contract. Like, you acknowledge that it's not a contract, and we reserve the right to change anything about the plan that we want, anytime, for any reason, right? We don't do it. I can't recall a time where we did that, but it's there. And the point that I made in my presentation that I would also make is that a lot of times comp planning is a deciding between a lot of like not great options. And so in this case, right, the reason that, or one of the reasons we have that provision is that a people problem, while not good, is way better than a legal problem, right? So if you change someone's comp plan arbitrarily at some point, and it's probably not arbitrary, there's a reason for it, but if you do that and the AE gets pissed off and quits, that's bad, obviously. That's not great. You don't want that, but it's way better than getting sued and having to defend a lawsuit. right? So just kind of like another way that we try to think about things, right? So try to keep things flexible, give us discretionary options, right? So what we try to do is we're very, very clear about the mechanisms and scenarios in which we might try to exercise one of these provisions. And then to some extent, mostly because the times that these things come up are almost always edge case scenarios, and you can't really predict all of the edge cases, we leave flexibility in the resolution layer, right? We don't prescribe how we're going to resolve that problem because we don't know what the problem is necessarily going to be until it happens.
I love this so much. I think, if you think about your general billing and pricing model, it's fairly complicated, I'd say. But then you keep the comp plan simple, fair, transparent, and you essentially you hedge your downside as a company, which I think is also important, right? To your point. And then often, the business changes. Your comp plan was created a few years ago, and you might need to adjust it, right? And if you adjust it in the sensible way, everybody will understand. There's no sales leader, RevOps leader that wants to piss off everybody and make everybody leave, right? Why should you do that? You lose, right? So, but I think it's a great example of like, okay, the underlying business is fairly complicated, and sometimes even in a way that you cannot predict. But then you create those, processes around it, and to essentially achieve that. I really like that these examples.
One more question I want to ask, and then I think we can close it off. But one thing I'm curious about is, so which tools are you using to manage that comp plan? Because I think that's just that's good to hear for our listeners.
Yeah, in alignment with our sort of comp planning philosophy, we're pretty scrappy in the tooling. Like we don't have a lot of in fact, we don't have any dedicated tooling. We don't have a commissions calculation tool. And for the planning exercise itself, it's Excel and Google Sheets, right? We're working with finance to build out our annual plan starting about mid-year. So we'll probably be starting that here sometime later this month. And we're building out our pipeline and sales target model, capacity model, all of that in a giant, I think we were using Google Sheets last year. And then we design the plan sort of calculator, not the commission calculator, but literally when we go to create the plans, right, there's a bunch of different variables that we have to figure out, especially around commission rates, so figuring out an A's commission rate for this or that based on the total portion of their variable comp that's available for this component of the plan, and their target, right? The math is pretty easy. Depending on what it is, it can literally be the amount of variable, or rather the target divided by the amount of the variable comp that's assigned to that target. But we use Google Sheets to build out the plans so that we, when we're ready to send them out, we've already got all the data, and we can just, merge it into a PDF and email it out. On the commission calculation side, we used to use a commission calculation tool and just didn't have a great experience with it. And that happened about mid-year. So instead of trying to figure out a new tool, which would have taken, at least a month or two, I think we were in August when we decided this tool's not working for us. So, that would have taken us into October. And at that point, what's the benefit, at least for last year, of having the commission tool? So we took a stab at building our own commission calculation tool in Salesforce, with the understanding that if it worked, we would we would then make it our source of truth in 24. And it did. So this year we're using a completely Salesforce native solution that we built in-house. Without getting too into the weeds on it, it's basically 4 custom objects and a series of flows that run on a scheduled basis. So the custom objects are commissionable amount, which is a child object of the opportunity. It just allows us to make adjustments to the amount that is eligible for commission based on the op. So like we have certain products, say, that are not eligible for commission. So we scrape those out and we create this commissionable amount record that tells us how much is eligible for commission on this op, how much of it represents renewal business or existing business or new business. We have 3 other objects. One is the commission itself, which is a record. Shoot, did I lose you guys?
No.
Okay, sorry.
Silently nodding away here.
Your face is froze on my screen, so that's on my end. But anyway, the commission record represents the commission itself. It's a child object of all 3 of the other objects: the commissionable amount, the sales target record, which is a 3rd object, and a sales commission plan record. And each of those house metadata about that component of the process, right? So the sales target has the target itself, but it also has the type of target that it is. Is it a currency target? Is it a core hour target in the case of our CS team? New, expansion, et cetera. Same with the sales commission plan. The sales commission plan defines what is the commission rate for that particular component of the plan. If it hits accelerators, what's the accelerator rate? Does it retire quota? Does it not retire quota? All of that stuff, right? So basically what we did was we parameterized all of the components of our targets and our plans and housed them in custom object records. And then the flows that we run just reference the parameters that are housed in those custom object records as variables, right? So we run a nightly batch job. There's actually 10 flows that run everything. 4 of them are like administrative, sort of cleanup, like data cleanup type flows. And 6 of them are there to calculate commissionable amounts for sales and solutions, then to calculate the actual commissions off of those commissionable amounts, 1 for sales, 1 for solutions again. And then we have 2 additional flows for our SDR team, 1 for our SDR director, because she has like an overlay component of her plan. And so the logic needs to be a little bit different. And then another one to calculate the commissions for all of the SDRs. And like I said, they run once every 24 hours. We just run a check to see if anything new has appeared in the system that is commission eligible. And if it has, we run it through whatever the relevant flow or flows are, and just calculate the commissions that way.
Got it.
And it's been working so far. We couple that with a Salesforce dashboard that we built that gives AEs a good amount of visibility into how they're tracking in terms of attainment, payouts, and all the other stuff they might want to look at.
Cool. Yeah. So for our listeners out there, right, it is possible. You can do it. If Gabe can do it, you can do it. No,
not so sure.
No, Gabe's pretty high up there. He showed us some of the setups that they've built in Salesforce. So it's not the only one. That's, I think, quite impressive. There is more. If you go to an opportunity detail page at Rescale, then that's quite impressive. Gabe, thank you so much. Closing question. So we always try to ask one closing question that has nothing to do with the topic itself. And I want to change it around a little bit. So here's a new one that I haven't asked anybody else. So looking back at your career, what's something outstanding someone has done for you that has truly impacted your life?
I'm going to give you two. There's a lot. I'm going to give you two. The first one is just the guys over at Blue Wolf. giving me a chance as a 34-year-old refugee attorney trying to make a career change. When they were running a department of mostly like early to middle 20-somethings doing the same job, and just sort of recognizing that I would bring things to the table that none of the other employees had, just by virtue of my experience and, partially my law background, even though I literally knew nothing about Salesforce. I mean, zero. So those guys giving me an opportunity, and I'll be forever grateful for that. It really got me out of a career that was making me unhappy. And then I would say my mentor, a guy named David Hong, who was the director of sales operations at a company called OpenDNS, which was one of my clients at Blue Wolf. And despite some early, fairly significant screw ups on my part, because I was a steep part of the learning curve in that engagement, recognizing somehow that I could have a lot of value, and that I had a good sort of way of thinking about this stuff, and recruiting me to join him at PagerDuty when he left OpenDNS and went to PagerDuty. I ended up working for him at 3 different companies: PagerDuty, then Lookout, and then Mesosphere. So yeah, I would say those 2 things are really big standout things that people did for me.
Great. Pay it forward. Thank you so much. It was great having you.
Okay,
thanks, guys.
So
yeah, really good to see you again, and we'll talk soon.
Talk soon.
Thank you.
Bye, all.